For years, Washington has been running what it believed was a winning strategy. Billions of dollars allocated, legislation crafted at the highest levels of government, export controls tightened around advanced chips, restrictions placed on cryogenic machinery, bans hammered into place blocking American money from flowing into Chinese quantum computing ventures. And then, in January of 2026, a bill sailed through the House of Representatives with a vote of 369 to 22, designed to cut China off from even touching quantum computers through remote cloud access. The message from Washington could not have been clearer. America intended to win the quantum race by making sure China could not run it. But while Washington was drafting those laws, while trade tensions were hardening into something that looked more like a technological siege, something else was happening in a laboratory in Hefei. China was finishing a quantum chip, not a chip that beat America's technology on raw performance metrics, not a chip that had more powerful qubits or longer coherence times, something far more unsettling to American strategic planners, a chip whose entire architecture was built on foundations that American policy has no power to disrupt. The materials came from domestic sources. The fabrication methods were developed internally. The photonic design relied on components China either makes itself or can get without ever needing to call an American supplier. And those supply chains were not assembled in a rush. They were constructed deliberately over 2 decades by Chinese strategists who spent 20 years preparing for the exact moment America tried to shut the door. By the time the sanctions arrived, the chip was already built. To understand the full weight of what China has actually done here, you need to understand something that almost nobody in Western media is explaining clearly. China has not been running one quantum computing program. It has been running 2 simultaneously on completely different hardware platforms, achieving world-class results in both, and no other nation on Earth has pulled that off. These 2 tracks represent fundamentally different approaches to harnessing the strange behavior of particles at the quantum scale, and China chose them for reasons that go far beyond scientific curiosity. The first track is superconducting quantum computing. If you have heard of Google's quantum program or IBM's quantum roadmap, you already know this territory. Superconducting quantum computers use tiny electrical circuits that are cooled to temperatures so extreme they make the vacuum of outer space seem warm. We are talking about temperatures near absolute zero, the theoretical floor of coldness in the universe, where electrical resistance vanishes and quantum mechanical behavior becomes something engineers can work with and control. It is extraordinarily demanding technology, and China has been building it seriously for years. The lead institution is the University of Science and Technology of China, located in Hefei. The physicist at the center of the program is Pan Jianwei, working alongside his colleague Zhu Xiaobo. The processor family they developed carries the name Zhuchongzhi, a tribute to a Chinese mathematician from the 5th century. And the progression of that processor family tells a story that the quantum computing world cannot afford to dismiss. From Zhuchongzhi 2 in 2021 to Zhuchongzhi 3. Is 0 in March of 2025 to Zhuchongzhi 3. 2 in December of 2025. This is one of the most consistent and impressive development arcs that quantum computing research has ever produced. The second track is photonic quantum computing. This is where the story gets strategically profound. Instead of using superconducting circuits cooled to near absolute zero, photonic quantum computing uses individual particles of light as the fundamental carriers of quantum information. Photons are remarkable in this context because they do not lose their quantum properties at room temperature. No cryogenic infrastructure, no dilution refrigerators, no exotic cooling systems, just light moving through carefully engineered optical circuits. China's photonic program, embodied in a series of processors called Juzhong, built by the same team at USTC in partnership with Tsinghua University, is the most advanced photonic quantum computing effort anywhere in the world. And the reason China chose photonics for one of its 2 parallel tracks is the same reason American export controls cannot touch it. Start with Zhuchongzhi 3. 2, because the achievement it represents in December of 2025 needs to be understood without the distortions that come from either Chinese government enthusiasm or American strategic minimization. What the USTC team demonstrated in a paper published in Physical Review Letters, one of the most rigorous and respected peer-reviewed journals in the entire field of physics, was something that only one other laboratory anywhere on Earth had ever done before. They operated a quantum processor below the fault tolerance threshold using superconducting technology. That phrase, below threshold, is the dividing line that separates quantum computers that are essentially sophisticated scientific instruments from quantum computers that are on the path to genuinely transformative computational power. Being below threshold means that when you add more physical qubits to your error correction system, the rate of logical errors actually decreases rather than increases. The system is correcting its own mistakes faster than those mistakes can accumulate. It is the moment where quantum error correction stops being a theoretical aspiration and starts being a demonstrated reality. Google's Willow processor crossed that threshold in December of 2024, and the response across the quantum computing world was one of genuine excitement. It was treated as a turning point, and it was. Zhuchongji 3. 2 crossed the same threshold exactly 12 months later, becoming the first quantum processor outside of the United States to achieve this milestone. The error suppression factor China's team recorded was 1.4, meaning that with each expansion of the error correction code, the logical error rate measurably declined. It is not as impressive a margin as Google achieved, and if you look at the raw qubit quality metrics, the gap is real. Zhuchongji 3. 2's T1 relaxation time, a measure of how long a qubit holds its quantum state before losing it to the environment, comes in at around 15 microseconds. Google's Willow achieves roughly 68 microseconds. The absolute qubit quality is not yet at the same level, but below threshold is a binary condition. You are either below it or you are not. There is no partial credit, no almost. China crossed it. And the technique they used to cross it was not borrowed from any American research paper, not adapted from any published Google methodology, not built on any IBM technical disclosure. It was developed in Hefei by Chinese researchers who have been working on this problem independently under conditions of increasing international isolation for years. The technique is called an all-microwave quantum state leakage suppression architecture. Leakage is one of the most stubborn and damaging problems in superconducting quantum computing. When a qubit makes an error in a well-behaved system, the error stays within the computational space. The qubit either flips from 0 to 1 or from 1 to 0, and the error correction system is designed to detect and fix exactly that kind of mistake. But sometimes a qubit does something worse. It leaks entirely out of the computational space, transitioning into a higher energy state that the error correction protocol was never designed to handle. When that happens, the leakage can corrupt the measurement signals that the entire error correction process depends on, spreading damage through the system in ways that standard correction codes cannot address. The all-microwave leakage suppression architecture that the USTC team developed tackles this problem entirely through the microwave control pulses used to operate the qubits without requiring any additional hardware components or modifications to the physical chip. The technique reduces the leakage rate while simultaneously preserving the high fidelity necessary for below-threshold operation. This was not adapted from existing research. It was invented under circumstances where access to American scientific institutions and technological resources was progressively being restricted. The restriction did not stop the work. It pushed the work in directions that are now specifically difficult for outside programs to replicate. Now, Zhuchang 4. 0. Because this is where the strategic implications of China's quantum program stop being a matter of scientific competition and become something that rewrites the terms of the entire geopolitical contest. To understand why Zhuchang 4. 0 matters the way it does, you first have to understand the single most important choke point in superconducting quantum computing. Every superconducting quantum computer operating anywhere in the world right now, whether it is running in a Google data center, an IBM research lab, or a Chinese university, depends on the same piece of equipment: a dilution refrigerator. These are extraordinarily specialized machines, enormously expensive and genuinely difficult to engineer. They cool quantum processors down to roughly 15 millikelvin, 15 thousandths of a degree above the theoretical coldest possible temperature in the universe. The global market for dilution refrigerators is a tiny elite club dominated by manufacturers in the United States, the United Kingdom, Finland, and the Netherlands. American export controls explicitly targeted these cryogenic systems precisely because, without them, a superconducting quantum computer cannot function. This was the choke point. This was the lever Washington believed it held. It is a real lever when it comes to China's superconducting track. China still faces genuine constraints from restricted access to the most advanced cryogenic systems. But China's photonic track was built over more than a decade of deliberate planning, specifically so that lever would never apply to it. Zhuchang 4. 0 operates at room temperature. It needs no dilution refrigerator. It contains no components manufactured by any American-controlled supplier. A quantum computer that runs without cryogenic support and draws on a fully domestic supply chain is not a scientific curiosity. It is a geopolitical instrument. Zhuchang 4. 0 was announced in August of 2025 by the research team led by Pan Jianwei and Liu Chaoyang at USTC, working in collaboration with Tsinghua University and Zhuchang Quantum Technology Commonwealth Ltd. The processor works by taking 1,024 squeezed states of light and routing them through a programmable photonic circuit containing 8,176 distinct optical modes. A mode is an individual optical pathway through the circuit, a specific route a photon can travel as it moves through the system. The circuit achieves its complexity through a cascaded arrangement of 316 mode interferometers linked by fiber delay loops, a structure that engineers describe as cubic connectivity scaling. The fundamental insight is that the circuit complexity scales with the cube of the number of connected elements, while the physical hardware requirements scale only linearly. In practical terms, the system becomes exponentially more capable without requiring exponentially more physical resources. In a single computational run, Zhuzhong 4, 0 detected up to 3,050 individual photons. That is more than 10 times the photon count achieved by its predecessor, Zhuzhong 3. 0. And then there's the number that makes the strategic implications of this machine impossible to set aside with comfortable dismissals. Zhuzhong 4. 0 completed its target calculation, a specific quantum computational task called Gaussian boson sampling, in 6 microseconds. Running the same calculation on El Capitan, which at the time of Zhuzhong 4, 0's announcement was among the fastest classical supercomputers in existence, would require 10 to the power of 54 years. Let that number sit for a moment. 10 to the power of 54 years. The age of the universe is roughly 14 billion years. Written in scientific notation, that is approximately 1. 4 times 10 to the power of 10 years. The time it would take El Capitan to do what 0 did in 25. 6 microseconds is not just longer than the age of the universe, it is incomprehensibly longer. You could run El Capitan from before the Big Bang until the last stars in the universe have long since burned out, through the entire span of cosmic history, and you would not be within any meaningful fraction of the required time. Adding more processors does not help. Increasing memory bandwidth does not help. Writing better software does not help. The gap between classical simulation and what Zhuzhong 4.0 does is not a gap of engineering. It is a gap of physics. And the machine that demonstrates this gap runs at room temperature in a building that needs no exotic cooling infrastructure, built from components that bypass every export restriction Washington has deployed. The optical efficiency of Zhuzhong 4. 0's photon source deserves specific attention because it is central to why the system achieves the performance it does. The source efficiency is 92%, reached through a sophisticated spectral filtering design built around cascaded Mach-Zehnder interferometers with near-unity transmission. Previous generations of photonic quantum advantage experiments achieved source efficiencies of roughly 70%. That 22-point improvement is what allows Zhuzhong 4.0 to reach an effective squeezing parameter, the metric that quantifies the quantum advantage it demonstrates, that is more than 10 times higher than any prior Gaussian boson sampling experiment. The gap between 70% and 92% might sound incremental in percentage terms, but in the mathematics of quantum optics, it is the difference between a demonstration and a landmark. The USTC team also specifically designed Zhuzhong 4.0 to answer a challenge that had threatened to undermine the credibility of the entire photonic quantum computing field. In 2024, researchers published a paper in Nature Physics presenting a new classical simulation algorithm based on matrix product state methods that could reproduce the results of earlier photonic quantum advantage experiments more efficiently than anyone had previously managed. In quantum computing research, this kind of development, a new classical algorithm that catches up to a claimed quantum advantage, is the most serious form of scientific criticism a program can face. It means the claimed advantage might not be real. It means the quantum system might not actually be doing something a classical computer cannot. The Zhuzhong team did not ignore this challenge. They built Zhuzhong 4.0 specifically to clear the new bar the challenge established. Their published paper includes a direct head-to-head comparison between Zhuzhong 4.0's output and the best results the matrix product state method can achieve, demonstrating that even under conditions optimized for classical simulation, the quantum advantage remains intact. This paper was published in Nature, the same journal that has carried Google's and IBM's most significant quantum results. The peer review process it passed is the same process that gives those American results their scientific legitimacy. And then, alongside the publication of Zhuzhong 4.0's results, Lu Chaoyang made a statement that moves this story from impressive scientific milestone into long-term strategic inflection point. He described the results of Zhuzhong 4.0 as opening the path toward what he called trillion-qubit mode three-dimensional cluster states. A three-dimensional cluster state is a specific type of quantum resource from which fully universal quantum computation can be performed, meaning any quantum algorithm, not just the specialized sampling problem that Zhuzhong 4.0 currently demonstrates. The roadmap the USTC team is describing, from their current 8176 mode system toward the three-dimensional cluster state architecture needed for universal fault-tolerant photonic quantum computation, is a coherent technical progression grounded in real experimental results. The engineering challenges between where they are now and fault-tolerant universal photonic quantum computing are immense. Nobody is claiming otherwise. But the trajectory is real, the experimental foundation is solid, and the institutional investment behind it is enormous, sustained, and fundamentally insulated from American export restrictions in ways that no superconducting program can claim. The supply chain dimension of this story is one of the most underreported aspects of the entire competition, and it deserves careful examination. When American policymakers imposed export controls on cryogenic systems, quantum control electronics, and related technology, the anticipated effect was that China's quantum program would slow down, struggling to source the components it needed from a suddenly restricted international market. What actually happened mirrors a pattern that has played out repeatedly in other technology domains where America has attempted the same strategy. The export controls accelerated Chinese domestic development rather than constraining it. China's quantum industry posted revenues of 56 billion yuan in 2025, growing at annual rates exceeding 30%. The Hunyuan-1 neutral atom quantum computer, a 100-qubit system built by the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Wuhan, reached commercial deployment in October of 2025. One unit went to China Mobile, another was exported to Pakistan. The optical components and high-end lasers that make Hunyuan-1 function were supplied by local firms in Wuhan's Optics Valley. And Chinese media specifically celebrated those suppliers as evidence that the country had reduced its dependence on foreign technology. Origin Quantum, the leading commercial quantum computing company in China, released the fourth version of its Origin pilot operating system in February of 2026. It was presented as the world's first freely downloadable quantum computing operating system, with comprehensive coverage of hardware management, calibration, task scheduling, and multi-user orchestration across superconducting, trapped ion, and neutral atom platforms. And they made it available for free download to any university anywhere in the world that is building a quantum computer. This last point is worth pausing on because it reveals a dimension of China's quantum strategy that operates at a level of sophistication most coverage misses entirely. China is not simply building quantum computers for its own use. It is building the software standards, the programming frameworks, and the operating systems that will define how quantum computers are used globally, and it is distributing them for free in order to establish a dominant standards position before Western alternatives become sufficiently mature to compete for adoption. The country whose software stack becomes the default environment for the world's quantum computing users will carry an influence that no export restriction can retroactively remove. China saw that dynamic early and began acting on it. The critical minerals dimension adds yet another layer of strategic pressure. China controls the global supply of multiple materials that are not peripheral to quantum technology but essential to it. In December of 2024, China restricted exports of gallium, germanium, and antimony to the United States. In February of 2025, it extended those restrictions to bismuth, indium, molybdenum, tellurium, and tungsten. Several of these materials appear directly in quantum hardware. Indium arsenide, the semiconductor at the core of Microsoft's approach to topological qubits, is among the controlled materials. When bismuth was added to China's export control list, the spot price jumped from roughly $12 per kilogram to more than $108 per kilogram within weeks. In April of 2025, China placed export licensing requirements on gadolinium and 6 other heavy rare earth elements, including terbium, dysprosium, lutetium, samarium, scandium, and yttrium, materials for which China controls what amounts to a global monopoly. The quantum roadmaps of Microsoft, Google, and IBM all have material dependencies that now run through China's export licensing approval system. China's photonic quantum program, which uses light rather than exotic superconducting materials, was deliberately designed to minimize those dependencies. The chip America cannot copy is not simply a quantum device. It is a supply chain strategy that has been made physical, made real, and made operational. In November of 2025, the United States-China Economic and Security Review Commission published a formal report to Congress stating directly that China is actively pursuing quantum computing capabilities with cryptographic implications and is likely concealing the true location and status of its most advanced work. The Commission, which comprises senior analysts reporting to the legislative branch of the American government, stated that in this domain, being first could yield strategic consequences that cannot be reversed. The specific consequence they were describing is the ability to break RSA encryption and elliptic curve cryptography, the mathematical foundations that protect essentially all internet communications, financial transactions, classified government documents, and military command infrastructure around the world. A quantum computer capable of that does not need to announce itself. It does not need to publish results in a peer-reviewed journal. It only needs to run the algorithm once against the right targets without telling anyone it did. The Commission stated explicitly that it assumes China is concealing the status of its most advanced quantum computing efforts, Zhujiang 4, 0, and Zuchongji 3. 2 are what China chose to share with the world. The question of what China chose not to share is the one that occupies the attention of America's senior intelligence officials in ways that cannot be resolved from publicly available information. The strategic picture that emerges from everything China has built over the past 2 decades is not the story of a single dramatic chip that solves all the problems in one announcement. It is the story of coordinated, systematic, multi-decade investment in a technology that Chinese strategic planners identified as nationally critical, long before the phrase quantum supremacy had entered Western policy vocabulary. The state-led model that Western analysts often characterize as slower and less innovative than market-driven competition has produced, in the quantum computing domain, a coherent national program that is simultaneously operating at the global frontier in 2 entirely different hardware architectures, something no other country in the world has demonstrated. It has done this while building domestic supply chains to reduce component dependencies, while deploying commercial quantum cloud services that have accumulated over 20 million user visits, while releasing free open source software to capture global standards positions, while controlling the critical mineral supply chains that Western quantum programs depend upon, and while deliberately moving its most export control resistant technology to the front of its commercial roadmap. The title of this piece uses the phrase "America cannot copy." That phrase requires precision, because it is not an absolute claim about the capability of American researchers or American institutions. American quantum scientists are genuinely brilliant. American quantum programs are real, well-funded, and technically sophisticated. American companies are capable of building photonic quantum computers. What America cannot replicate is not the technology in isolation. It is the specific combination of structural conditions that produced China's quantum program, a state apparatus that designated quantum technology as a national priority in the early 2000s. Investment sustained continuously across multiple decades, undisturbed by the volatility of market cycles or the pressure of quarterly earnings reports. A coordinated national ecosystem linking universities, national laboratories, state enterprises, and strategic commercial companies under unified long-term direction. And the deliberate, patient construction of domestic supply chains for critical materials and components that Chinese strategists anticipated would eventually become targets of Western trade restrictions. The planning to build those supply chains predated the restrictions themselves by years. The United States has none of those structural conditions operating in quantum computing. American quantum programs depend on venture capital timelines. American hardware companies are structured to compete with one another rather than coordinate toward a national objective. American supply chains for quantum critical materials run through countries that are now geopolitical adversaries, which China itself partly controls through its dominance of critical mineral production and processing. And the export controls designed to restrain China have, with documented consistency in multiple technology domains, functioned instead as some of the most powerful accelerants of Chinese domestic development. They did it in semiconductor manufacturing. They did it in aerospace. They are doing it now in quantum computing. The January 2026 bill that passed the House of Representatives with 369 votes blocking China from cloud access to quantum computers is a meaningful step. But China's Tianyuan quantum cloud platform had already recorded more than 37 million user visits from more than 60 countries by the time the bill passed. The global community of quantum computing users is already forming habits, adopting software stacks, and building workflows in an environment where Chinese platforms and Chinese operating systems are free, accessible, and widely distributed. The software standards for quantum computing are being written right now. The programming frameworks, the operating system conventions, the development environments that will define how a generation of researchers and engineers interact with quantum hardware are being established in this window. Origin Pilot OS is free. IBM's Qiskit is free. The country whose software becomes the default for the world's emerging quantum computing ecosystem will hold an influence that no export control introduced later can reach or reverse. China understood that dynamic before most Western policymakers had grasped the significance of the hardware race, let alone the software race running beneath it. The quantum competition between the United States and China is not a race with a single finish line and a single winner who takes a trophy. It is a multi-decade strategic contest playing out simultaneously across hardware platforms, software standards, supply chains, scientific talent, technical education pipelines, and geopolitical influence in standards bodies. The decisions being made right now in laboratories in Hefei and Wuhan and Shenzhen by researchers who have spent 20 years building toward this moment are shaping the landscape in which all of those contests will be fought. The chip America cannot copy is already running. The question of what comes next is being decided in this exact window, and that window will not remain open indefinitely.